Hi guys, welcome back to Turn Your Lights On. This week's case is one that has absolutely shocked me since the first time I've heard about it. So I felt as though it was only fair to do some further research on the topic and share with you guys. I'm your host Emily, and I thank you all for being here with me for another episode. This case is one that's gonna absolutely knock your socks off. So as always, I urge you to turn your lights on. Now let's dive right in. We're gonna hop not too far back to 2003. Cipriano Garcia and his wife Barbara were living in Hobart, Indiana. Cipriano was actually born and raised in the Hobart area. He was retired from Ford and was a veteran of the Army, serving 2 tours in Korea. He was awarded the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. And Barbara was a retired nurse. Cipriano was the father of his 2 sons, Phil and Cipriano Jr., his daughter Crystal, and his stepdaughter Tammy. Barbara and Cipriano had met a few short years after he had returned from war in 1960, when he was as young as 21 years old. There was an immediate connection to Barbara on Cipriano's part, and the couple began dating rather quickly. But some sources say that Barbara may not have felt this immediate connection and wasn't exclusive to Cipriano. And it would be around this time where Barbara fell pregnant with her first child. However, the child's father was not Cipriano. Barbara had become pregnant with another man's child, and this man had no interest in stepping up and becoming a father to Barbara and his child. This is where Cipriano shows Barbara what kind of man he truly is by not only devoting himself to her, but to the child she was carrying as well. His love for her was so strong that there was not a doubt in his mind that he wanted to step up and become the person both Barbara and the baby needed. Cipriano actually goes as far as to propose to Barbara and offers to raise the child as his own. And in June of 1962, just 2 years after meeting, Cipriano and Barbara got married. And not long after, in the months following, Barbara gives birth to her first child, Tammy. Cipriano, of course, living up to his promise, decides to adopt Tammy and care for her as if she was his own. Cipriano treated Tammy just the same as he had the following 3 children, Phil, Cipriano Jr., and Crystal, that he and Barbara had together. Quickly, Cipriano became a family man. He was very devoted to his work at the Ford plant, but equally as devoted to his family. And at this time, Barbara was working as a nurse, but unfortunately her motherly instincts didn't quite go to the extent that Cipriano's fatherly instincts had. It almost seemed as though Cipriano was still over the moon for Barbara, but their relationship was just lacking something in Barbara's eyes. While Cipriano enjoyed spending his free time at home, one would actually usually catch Barbara enjoying her time gambling at the bingo table. However, Barbara's gambling addiction didn't just stop at bingo. Bingo was the headway into a much larger gambling problem. There was even a point in time where Barbara had disappeared. Almost like it was out of thin air, Cipriano came home one night to Barbara's things being gone. She returned after an entire week. Upon her arrival home, Cipriano had discovered that her disappearance was for the sole purpose of gambling. She went on a binge and returned home after she came down from the high. This instance took place about 30 years into their marriage. Barbara came down from the high after she had lost the entirety of the family savings. In as little as 1 week, Barbara was able to gamble away over $100,000. Her game of choice, however, wasn't the bingo table. According to my sources, she had lost the family savings at the slot machine. Cipriano was shocked to discover what had happened to their money when his wife came home. Allegedly, he had tried to withdraw money from this joint account but wasn't able to do so. And upon Barbara's arrival home, he quickly discovered why. As anyone would, Cipriano's first reaction was to remove his wife's name from their account, seeing as though she had proved to not be able to handle money on any scale. Cipriano's response to his wife, though, was exactly how one would expect it to be, considering how evident his love was for his wife. He had simply just been glad she returned home safely to him. And as of 2002, approximately 10 years after Barbara's big gambling fiasco, Cipriano decided to add Barbara back into the bank account. I'm sure this decision came after seeing Barbara's improvements, and I'm sure it definitely took some convincing on her part. Nonetheless, Cipriano felt it was appropriate at the time to do so, and not long after this decision, Barbara's daughter and Cipriano's stepdaughter, Tammy, ended up moving back in with her parents. Tammy was 40 years old at the time of her move. Her reason for moving back home was not made on a whim. Tammy had actually been suffering from diabetes for quite some time at this point. It had become a major obstacle in her life, one that kept her from obtaining and keeping a job. So she became unable to support herself, so her parents took her in her time of need. Tammy's arrival quickly drew a wedge between her and Cipriano. They struggled to live in the same home together due to their differing values, and this situation escalated relatively quickly. Tammy and Barbara tended to side with one another, but separate themselves from everyone else in the family, especially creating an intense situation between Cipriano and his daughter Crystal versus Barbara and Tammy. According to my sources, Barbara and Tammy had even gone as far as to get a restraining order against Crystal and her husband in 2003. Now, I wasn't able to find the exact reason for this restraining order, but throughout my sources, I put together the idea that there was a potential custody battle over Crystal's children. So it seems as though there was a lot of tension within the family. Barbara and Tammy were putting wedges between everyone and putting Cipriano right in the center of it all. Being the family man he was, he tried to stay neutral and keep the family in one piece, but with tensions constantly rising, Tammy and Barbara felt that he was either with them or against them. And at the peak of this family dispute, Cipriano had his hands full and was very much distracted from what was happening behind closed doors. Barbara was actually relapsing into her old ways, and having access to their joint bank account allowed her access to fund her gambling addiction. But this time, her gambling addiction wasn't the only thing Barbara was funding. While she was stealing money for her addiction, she was also stealing money for Tammy. But here's where Barbara goes into panic mode. I guess Cipriano had shared with her that he planned on visiting the bank on Halloween to make a withdrawal. And instantly, Barbara realized the severity of this news. If Cipriano went and visited the bank, he would be able to see the balance that was now missing $4,000 from funding a gambling trip and Tammy's needs. And in her eyes, this simply wouldn't do. This would surely be the straw that broke the camel's back. With all the bickering going on between family members, and now the gambling relapse, Barbara knew this would be the end of her marriage. And after approximately 40 years of marriage, Barbara decided that the only way she would have access to these funds was if she killed her husband. The money to gamble and fund her luxurious lifestyle, as well as Tammy's, was seemingly far more important to Barbara than the man that so desperately loved her and that she had been with for 4 decades. And on the 30th of October in 2003, Barbara had come up with her murder plan. This next little blurb of information I'm going to give you guys is going to come directly from Garcia, U.S. law. I wanted to give you guys this direct piece of court appeals so that I didn't miss anything in the timeline that happened the day of Cipriano's death. But before I read this to you, I just want to clarify that they acknowledge Barbara as Garcia and Cipriano by his first name. So, according to Justia.us law, quote, on October 30th, 2003, Garcia and her husband, Cipriano Garcia, began arguing at their residence in Hobart. Cipriano eventually told Garcia that he was going to leave in the morning and remove her name from his bank account and that she would never receive another dime from him. Garcia became afraid that upon going to the bank, Cipriano would notice that she had withdrawn approximately $4,000 to give to Tammy, Garcia's daughter, and Cipriano's stepdaughter. Garcia prepared a cup of coffee for Cipriano, dissolving Klonopin and Artane in the beverage to cause him to fall asleep. After he drank the coffee and fell asleep, Garcia retrieved insulin that she had previously taken from Tammy, who is diabetic, and injected Cipriano with a lethal amount of the drug. Garcia, a licensed practical nurse, intended to inject enough insulin into Cipriano to kill him because she didn't want him to go to the bank the next day. Once Cipriano was dead, Garcia tried to move his body by using a rug. While Garcia was dragging the body, Tammy entered the house. Garcia told Tammy that Cipriano had died from a heart attack and that they needed to dispose of the body so that Garcia could still receive his retirement and Social Security checks. Tammy agreed to help, and the two women dragged the body into the garage. They were unable at the time to lift the body into the back of Garcia's truck, however, so they went inside and watched television. The following day was Halloween, and after Garcia and Tammy handed out candy to the children in the neighborhood, they again attempted, and again failed, to lift the body into the truck. The following night, they again failed in moving the body. The following day, after going to a party, Garcia and Tammy finally succeeded in moving the body into the truck by using a blue tarp, a board, electrical cords, and another vehicle. Garcia drove Cipriano's body to a lake in Illinois, where she moved the body out of the truck and down the edge of a slope alongside the lake. Because it was beginning to rain and the slope was becoming slippery, Garcia left the body halfway down the slope covered in a rug, a blue tarp, and electrical cords and tied to cinder blocks. Subsequently, a passerby discovered the body and notified police. End quote. From what authorities know from the get-go, Cipriano had been missing for about 3 days, and neither his wife Barbara nor his stepdaughter Tammy had reported him missing. So right off the bat, authorities were suspicious as to why Cipriano's wife wouldn't immediately call authorities, especially when Cipriano is as old as he was. It was also apparent to authorities that Cipriano must have been at home at the time of his death, because when he was found, he was wearing pajamas and not the typical ready-for-the-day attire. So with their suspicions already heightened, they decided to reach out to Cipriano's brother to identify him instead of his wife and stepdaughter. After running fingerprints on the body, they were able to discover that the John Doe is Cipriano Garcia, and Cipriano's brother John was immediately able to confirm the body of his brother, and from here, investigators had decided to do an autopsy to discover his cause of death. Now, they actually did a toxicology report and were able to discover that not one, but 2 different tranquilizers had been found in his system, and those were the 2 that I mentioned that were in the Court of Appeals. However, the amount of tranquilizer within his system wouldn't have been enough to cause his death. What did cause his death was an abnormally large amount of insulin. The weird part of it all was not only did Cipriano have almost 7 times the amount of insulin that a typical adult would need, but he wasn't diabetic. So there was no need for him to be taking insulin in the first place. But we know that Tammy was diabetic. And with the information that had been laid out in court on November 10th, 2003, Barbara was charged with murder and sentenced to 55 years in prison by the state. In October of 2005, it was concluded by a judge that her previously enforced sentence would be what she would serve. As far as Tammy, the only information I was able to find was that she pleaded guilty to moving the body and got a maximum of 3 years in prison. If the hiker that was going through the woods where Cipriano was found had never gone for a hike that day, this case may have had a different ending. Cipriano was an older man, and he had been living a marriage that was seemingly okay from the outside. So who knows how long it would have been for someone on the outside looking in to discover his disappearance. And that's the case of Cipriano Garcia, a truly dedicated father and devoted husband. The absolute greed in this case was what really drew me to cover it, because oftentimes money is a motive for murder. But this case was really one like no other. Thank you guys for joining me for another episode of Turn Your Lights On. Every week I'm seeing more recommendations on cases coming in, and I'm truly excited to cover all of them for you guys. Keep sharing your recommendations with me, because some of these cases are new to me as well, and I love researching them. I will see you again next week with another episode, but while we're coming to an end on this week's case, make sure you turn your lights on.